common conversation I have with other men my age or other young families, like young married couples my age, is, man, we've learned X, Y, and Z from our parents or from our grandparents or other families a generation older than us. And I think partly because we seem to be we're still in the information age, I think, where we have access to a lot of information and it comes at us fast. You've got people that are deconstructing their faith, or they're deconstructing how they grew up. And maybe there's a place for that. Maybe some of that's helpful or healthy. But I'm not really talking about deconstructing as much as I am being a learner and being somebody who's wanting to say, yeah, this way of doing it was good, this way of doing it was bad. I want to take the good and carry that on to the next generation and kind of leave behind the bad. And then you also got to recognize, or at least I have to recognize, that my children are going to be doing the same thing. Hopefully. They're going to be saying, man, Dad did this really well. Or we saw other families when we were kids doing this really well, and it was pretty common. And maybe we don't want to do it that way whenever we get older. And so my conversations I've had with people on this topic, I've not really gotten into okay, what is an absolute biblical issue where the way of Jesus made it really clear for a young family, you need to operate this way. So where would we say, yes, these are no questions asked. This is how you do it, according to God. And what are things that we have believed for years were biblical, and this was the way of God, that we can survey now and say, actually, I think that was just the way of James Dobson. and it's not actually biblical. And I'm not saying that every single thing you do with your kid or don't do with your kid, there has to be a Bible verse connected to that. But I guess if I'm learning anything into my 30s now, is that there's a lot of things I've believed were the way of God or the way of Jesus or the way of the Bible, that I'm like, man, I wonder if that was just a cultural thing. Like, we did it that way in Texas. But they don't do it that way in Germany, in a Christian family there who loves and celebrates Jesus. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So have you given much thought to that now? Now, you got grandkids now. You've got adult children, or your son and daughter are grown. They've got kids. So you've got a couple generations now that you can look back on and see, man, I'd have left that behind if I'd have been thinking different.
Yeah, well, I look back at my own life, and my grandfather had 13 kids.
I had no idea. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so my father was one of 13.
Okay.
My grandmother died early when I was like 6 years old, or earlier actually, and I don't remember her much. So my grandfather and I became best buddies.
Okay, yeah.
Because he lived just a quarter mile down the road. Well, he was tough.
Yeah.
He was tough on his kids.
Sure.
He wasn't tough on me.
Yeah.
I just knew not to mess with him.
Yeah.
But he and I, sitting on the front porch, talked about that. So I was like, I would ask him, Granddaddy, if you had to do over, would you raise your kids the same way? He'd go, oh no, son. I made a lot of mistakes. But he ruled with an iron hand.
Yeah.
And his whole deal was, as long as you're in my house, you're under my rule.
Yeah.
And he was sometimes very arbitrary.
Sure.
Well, my dad loosened up a little bit, but he was a little bit that way. And so every generation is learning from the other generation things that are cultural as well as biblical.
Yep.
And of course, my family was, they were Christian. At least they went to church. And so they wanted to do everything biblically.
Yep.
So it's like, I'm going to raise this kid up in the way he should go, and when he's old, he won't depart from it. But that way he should go mostly came from the way your dad did you, and the way they're doing it at the church. And we don't need to discount that, because the way God designed the brain is that the way you decide what you do does that coincide with my people? So your brain knows what your brain knows. You are by design a social person, which means what your people think matter to you.
Yeah.
That's why peer pressure, gangs, what the whole thing works.
Sure.
So as you grow up, you pick up my people's values.
Yep.
So that means your mom, your dad, your uncles, your aunts, And in my case, since I grew up in the country and went to a little Baptist church, those were my people too. And everybody raised their kids basically the same way.
Yeah. Right.
And I think what happens as we come along, as we move along, is we understand more and more the power of unconditional love and the power of grace more than depending on law to make our kids good.
Okay.
See, the one thing.
Talk to me about that.
Okay, so my mom was a master psychologist. She could manipulate you really well.
Yeah.
She knew how to push the right buttons, and so I'm not blaming her, but from her generation, it was, I want you to be a good boy. So from that, I began to assume that God wanted me to be a good boy.
Yeah. Right.
And a good boy is one who acts right.
Right.
No matter what's going on in his heart.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you you weren't the only one that was raised like that. I'm not saying about just me. I mean, practically everyone I know, that was be a good boy.
Be a good boy. And my people valued good boys better than they valued independent thinkers, bad boys.
Okay.
In other words, I got more benefit out of being a good boy because my parents liked it,
Sure.
my uncles liked it,
Yeah. Your
people at the
community
church liked it,
it.
my coach liked it at school, my teachers liked it at school. So why not be a good boy? You got all this affirmation stuff coming. And the bad boys, only a few people liked them, and that was their buddies. So they got drunk and they did bad things.
Right.
Well, I didn't, but I sure would have liked to try it one time. And so I think, growing up to wanting to be a good boy, God works it all out, because eventually I realized I couldn't be a good boy. And it started getting through to me that Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. I wasn't loving him. I was just keeping his commandments to keep from making somebody mad. So behavior was my issue, not my heart.
Yeah.
So the real challenge for you and Corinne, or anybody, me and my grandkids, how do I parent the heart?
Yeah.
Knowing that there is some need in there for law to be there, principles, rules, whatever, because it's the law that exposes the inability of the heart to do things.
Yep.
And so unless somebody's got some concept of being a good boy, whatever that means, of having law, if they don't have some exposure to it, they never realize how inadequate they are.
Yeah.
And so they never are they're never a candidate for grace and mercy and forgiveness. And so what I've tried to do with the grandkids, of course, this is the benefit of a grandparent over a parent, because parents, it's kind of your reputation rides on these kids.
Yeah.
Well, grandparents, it's like if they mess up, it's their problem.
Yeah.
Kids, it's my kid's problem.
Sure.
We joke about that. That's not really true, but there is.
Yeah, but you relate to your grandkid differently than how you did your kid.
Yeah.
So to interject real quick, I have heard someone say, don't know if this is, I haven't thoroughly thought this through, but I've heard people say that it's actually healthier the way a grandparent relates to their grandchild than the way most parents relate to their kid. That is actually more in line with, that's going to produce more flourishing long-term for that kid than the way we rule with an iron fist as parents.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Generally, I do, but there are certain things that parents have to put in place in order to have an orderly house.
Sure.
Where grandparents are not going to get on to you for not picking up your clothes.
Right. Yes.
and mom has to.
Totally agree with that.
And mom's got to say, no, you eat breakfast, or
That's right.
you know.
That's right.
Whereas the grandparents don't have to. But generally speaking, I would say that is true because your reputation is not riding on it, and you're able to just love
Yep.
and guide and let their heart be exposed
Yeah. Yeah.
rather than trying to control them.
So, a topic that's been, I didn't intend for this to turn into like a parenting conversation. I wanted to talk more about generation to generation stuff, but one thing that has come up also in conversation is this idea of immediate obedience, and that being the demand in the parent-child relationship is that we demand immediate obedience, regardless of whether your heart is in it or not. So a little further explored would be, it's true to say there's sometimes you got to do things you don't want to do.
Yeah.
And that's just part of life. But this idea, when I heard it, was trying to explore in a way what Jesus would preach and proclaim toward when he's rebuking the Pharisees. Is like, y'all do all this stuff, but your heart isn't turned toward the Father.
Yeah.
Your heart isn't turned toward God. It's just empty deeds. And that related back to parenting was an interesting thing, and has been an interesting thing for me to try to flesh out. Like, am I after immediate obedience, immediate mindless obedience, just do it because I said to do it or else? Or am I after, I don't know how it works because we're trying to figure it out, but am I in it for the long game of like, when you do what I ask you to do or tell you to do as a parent, I want it to be born out of your interest in, like, I want it to be born out of love and a transformed heart, like where you do the right thing, not because it's the right thing. You do it because your heart's been changed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but there are two sides of that whole deal. Like, I remember having the conversation with my kids. It's like, look, I'm not always right, but I'm always your dad. And I'm always responsible to God for your protection and for your flourishing.
Yep.
So I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to make some mistakes, but I'm going to do the best I can. But I'm older than you. My brain is a little bit more developed than yours. And I've had some more experiences. And I love you more than you love yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want you to just know that as a kid. Now, there's certain things that I need you to be instant in obedience. I want you to learn to be instant because I would use this illustration. You're out playing in the street. You're having so much fun.
Yeah.
And I look up, you don't see it, but I look up and here comes a car, 60 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And I say, get out of the street. I don't need you to stand up and go, why?
Right. I need immediate
I
obedience.
need immediate obedience, otherwise you're dead.
That's right.
And then I'm a bad. So you need to learn to trust me that if I tell you something, you obey. But then I'd always try, at least as I got a little older, but which did it pretty young, later you always have a right to come back and appeal and say, why?
Yeah. Yep.
And
Because then you're cultivating their ability to think.
yes.
Yeah,
right.
and reason. Yeah.
And you can say, why did you ask me to do that? And then I would say, sometimes if it's not something where it has to be immediate, you can appeal even at the time. Now, I may not grant you appeal, but you can appeal.
Yeah.
And so they would say, okay, can we discuss that?
Yeah.
And if it was a need, I would say, yeah, what's your objection?
Yeah.
Other times it's like, no, we can't discuss it because that's the right answer.
Yep. I've tried to get in the rhythm with my son of when I give him a directive, to, like you did, I want him to be trained and thinking that dad knows more than me. He knows best, and he ultimately wants my good and my flourishing. So when dad gives me a directive, the helpful response is, yes, dad. And if you're confused about it or concerned about it, what you say is, yes, dad, I've got a question.
Yeah.
And you're welcome to bring that up, because I don't want him to get in the habit of not being a thinker and not being evaluative or analytical. I think he's got some giftings in that area. Of course, we all think our kids are gifted in every area, but he is an analytical person, and I don't want to squash that.
Right.
I want to see that gifting, if it is that it grows and flourishes appropriately. And like you've said before, if you have all this analytical ability and you like to question things, that's great. But if it's not submitted to a final authority, then it's unruly and it's out of balance. And of course, in the fully developed form, we're submitting to God's authority and who He is. And we want to know that, your analytical ability can flourish, but it really flourishes best when it's submitted to the final word, and that being, God's.
Yeah.
So,
So I think as long as we keep in mind that I am God's delegated human instrument here, but He is the ultimate authority. And I try to keep conveying to the kid, hey, I'm just trying to do what God told me to do. I'm the intermediary, whatever that word is.
Yeah.
I'm the one who's conveying to you what God wants for you. And then, try to help the kid to understand, look, you're loving me more than you think.
Yeah.
You like to run up and go, oh, Daddy, I love you, and put your arm around me. That's one expression of love.
Yeah.
Another expression of love is you trust me. So whether you wanted to do it or not, you did it.
Yeah.
Because you know that I might know what's best.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's loving me.
Yeah, that's good.
And so when you obey God and you're just like, I don't know why God asked me to do that, but you do it in obedience to Him, that's loving God.
Sure. Yeah.
So
Yeah, there's a faith element involved there too. It's love motivated.